everyone. So my name is Rowan Khan. I'm a professor here at Purdue. I started in the fall, and I have my PhD in counseling psychology. So just to give you a little bit of background, kind of what I spent the last few years doing is primarily I worked with adults and youth providing mental health therapy. And then another big part of my role, and still is part of my role, is conducting research on mental health. So I tend to focus on Middle Eastern, North African, immigrant and refugee communities, as well as Muslim communities. And I like to focus on kind of the positive aspect of mental health. So I focus a lot on well-being and how to uplift well-being in our communities and how to build on protective factors amongst you. So today I'm going to talk about kind of both sides of mental health in a way. I'll touch on kind of mental well-being, positive psychological functioning, and then I'll touch on also kind of mental illness. And we'll talk about that as well as ways to care for other people in your life and care for their mental health and ways to care for your mental health as well. So, but before we get started, I just want to get an idea. How many folks in here are youth? So college age, high school age, you just put your hand up. I don't see how many. Nice, okay. We have a good amount in the crowd. So when I was creating this presentation, I obviously had that piece in mind, but I also figured there would be some parents in here as well. So I'll be talking a little bit about, as parents, how you might be able to help your children as well, kind of in this world of mental health. All right, so first, what is mental health? And I kind of want to hear from some people in the crowd. This is a really big term, encompasses a lot of different things, but when I say mental health, what is something that some of you think about?
Anxiety, depression.
Anxiety, depression, stress. Yes, that's one. Anything else?
It's how you think or respond to a certain situation.
Yeah, definitely. So how you think or respond. Yeah, so they're all wonderful definitions. They all fit under this larger umbrella of what is mental health. So this first slide is focusing on mental health in a positive sense. So thinking about our emotional well-being, our social well-being, and our psychological well-being. So when I talk about these things, I'm talking about one, being productive in your activities. So when you go to work, when you go to school, how well are you doing in those spaces? Do you feel like you have the energy or the mental capacity to actually be present and participate in those activities, or are you kind of struggling? And then the second piece is having healthy relationships, right, with your family members as well as folks at school or at work. And then being able to cope with stressful and difficult events. So it's inevitable that we're going to go through challenges in our life. And I think sometimes, especially amongst the teen clients that I would see in therapy, is that there was this assumption of there's something wrong with me if I feel sad or if I feel anxious. Like there's this kind of assumption of I always need to feel okay and content. And until I feel okay and content always, then I will need to keep going to therapy, right? It's kind of like cure me of everything and that's when I'll be okay. But that's not really realistic, right? Because we know as human beings, we are going to go through struggles, we're going to go through challenges. So something that therapy does is it acknowledges that and it says, how can we help you get through those challenges and be ready to deal with them? Another part of mental health is this concept of emotional awareness. So if you could just, you don't have to answer this out loud, but just kind of think to yourself, check in with yourself right now, like how are you feeling right now? What emotions are coming up for you right now? Maybe you're curious, maybe you're kind of hopeful that you'll learn something here. So if you're able to pick up on that piece, that's what I'm talking about when I say emotional awareness, right? Is you're able to check in with yourself and understand how you're feeling and how you're doing. So a couple of different pieces of this. Emotions come and go, right? Oftentimes as therapists, we have this phrase that's sometimes you just have to ride the wave. So if you're feeling really anxious in the moment, sometimes the best you can do is ride the anxiety until it ends. The wave will end. It won't be there forever. Emotions can be mild, intense, happiness or anywhere in between. And there are no good or bad emotions, right? I think we often think about, well, obviously I'd rather be happy than sad or content than mad, but this goes back to the piece that I mentioned earlier of it being completely normal for us to experience a wide range of emotions. Actually, it'd be atypical if I heard from somebody like, I never feel sad, I never feel mad, I never feel frustrated. That's just not a realistic human experience. So there are a couple things you can ask yourself when you're thinking about emotional awareness. What am I feeling? How strongly am I feeling this? Can I find a reason why I might be feeling this way? And then how can I communicate that feeling? So I think an important point to note here, especially when thinking about parents and how to help your children, is that emotional awareness isn't something that we're just kind of immediately born with and that we have. It's something that develops over time. So it's important to set realistic expectations with your kids, right? Like when I work with, in therapy, when I work with kids that are very young, like 6 or 7 years old, some of the work that we do is first getting them to label their emotions. So kind of think about, what are you feeling right now? Many of you probably seen this and kind of have this experience, but you can tell when something is bothering a kid, right? But they're not telling you, but you can tell by their body language or their eye contact or whatever it may be. So at that age, something that we often do as therapists is we ask kids to learn how to tune into their body. Like, what are you feeling physically? Sometimes they'll say like, oh, I feel shaky inside. Oh, I just feel really tired. Like my head feels all confused. And then when we're able to help them cue into that, we can help them label that emotion of like, oh, it sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed, or it sounds like you're feeling this way. Just to kind of model that for them and help them start developing their own way of labeling those emotions. And then as teenagers, right, like typically you can pick out what you're feeling, maybe you can identify why you're feeling that way. But the piece to really work on is expressing that emotion in a healthy way. So, right, there's always jokes, teenagers are kind of like impulsive and they just kind of act. But this connects back to this idea of emotional awareness. So your teenager might be able to say, I'm feeling angry. This is why I'm feeling angry. And they might react to you in a very angry way, right? You're going to be able to tell if they're, speaking loudly to you or stomping around or whatever it may be. So the thing I want to emphasize here though is, although we are obviously allowed to have a wide range of emotions, our emotions don't give us the right to be disrespectful or harmful to other people. So yes, I could be mad, but my anger does not give me an excuse to say, take the anger out on, say, my husband, right? It's not something that I should impose on him, but rather it's a way that I need to figure out how to communicate in a healthy way by saying, I'm feeling this way because of this and this, rather than saying, you made me feel bad because you did all of this. So when you're thinking about like talking to your teenagers, or maybe even a little bit older, this might be the piece that they need more help with, is kind of calming down from that initial emotional reaction and getting them to really think about like, how can I express this an emotion that isn't hurtful to another person? And as a parent, being there to be responsive to that, and right, kind of giving them that piece of like, okay, they're worked up right now. How can I help them unwind and get them to a place where they can express this in a more healthy way? Okay, so switching gears a little, talk about well-being, the positive side of mental health, and then there's mental illness. So this is kind of the generic definition for APA. It's health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behaviors, or a combination of these that are associated with distress and problem functioning in social, work, or family activities. It's kind of a general statement, right? If you think about it, it makes sense if I think back to my clinical experience and when I work as a therapist, is what's distressful to one person at an intense level may not be equally distressful to another person. So when we are really working with individuals, we're thinking about how much are these symptoms impacting this person's life? Are they struggling to get through school? Are they struggling to get through work? And I'll talk about two of the kind of larger disorders that we see specifically with youth, which are depression and anxiety. But before we dive into that, I want to talk about a couple of myths and facts. So one myth that we frequently hear is therapy is only for people with a mental illness, so only somebody with a diagnosis. This isn't true. Actually, a lot of the work that specifically counseling psychologists do is that we help people get through problems that might seem typical or normal. So it could be maybe you move to a brand new location and you're having a really hard time adjusting. You're having a hard time finding friends or whatever it may be. That's something that a therapist can also help you through. So I think that's a big assumption that needs to be taken away because it stops people from reaching out for help because they don't think that they are severe enough if they don't have a diagnosis. And therapy is not just limited to that. Yeah.
Is there a threshold when we can classify emotions into an illness? Or,
Yeah. So that's a good question. So typically from kind of a more diagnostic lens, like that threshold that we use is how long the symptoms have been occurring. So for depression, typically we look at like 2 weeks and occurring more days than not. And then some other diagnoses differ in terms of like their time thresholds. But then we'll also look at the impact of functioning, right? So if you have a teenager who was all of a sudden doing really well in their classes, and now you're noticing their grades are slipping and they're not doing well, that's a very clear impact on their functioning. So the kind of threshold or the line for some of these diagnoses, like anxiety and depression, I don't think they are as clear cut as people assume them to initially be. Yeah, but a lot of it is based on kind of self-report, like what our clients are telling us they're experiencing. You know, there might be times where we give them inventories to get a better understanding of the actual symptoms they're experiencing. But yeah, it's not as clean, right? Yeah. Any other questions or anything before I move on?
And are there any signs for that? I mean, if there are different people who can actually fall into that state of depression based on their personality, what is it what one should be looking for?
Yeah, I'll actually talk about that. So I'll talk about the symptoms and kind of things for you to look out for your children, but also for you to look out for yourself too. So I'll talk about signs for both depression and anxiety. Let's see, where were we? So the second myth, mental health issues are a sign of weakness. These issues are a natural part of life. Mental illness is not a Muslim issue, but it's an issue for non-believers. This is an issue for all kinds of people, and there's a lot of folks right now within the world of research that are really focusing heavily on Muslim communities and mental health, how to uplift mental health in our communities, how to address some real mental health crises that we are experiencing. And then lastly, people with mental illnesses are violent. And this is one that we frequently hear, especially because of how some folks with certain mental illnesses are portrayed in the media. So, you know, we often hear about diagnoses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Those are kind of the ones that people point to the most, but what research actually tells us is that people with mental illness are actually more likely to, one, either harm themselves or to be harmed by another person. So this is a myth that has been kind of debunked from what we know in terms of what folks with mental illness are experiencing from other folks in the community. Okay, so diving into some of these kind of symptoms and signs to look out for. So depression, this can come to be for a variety of reasons, right? It could be chemical changes in your brain. There could be a genetic component throughout your family, or it could be something that came up in your life that has really resulted in a lot of sadness and has made it hard to kind of function on the day-to-day. But see, these are some of the most common symptoms, and these are the kind of like criteria that we use as therapists to when we're assessing. So we have depressed mood, no longer being interested in activities that you used to enjoy, changes in your appetite. So maybe you notice you're really not wanting to eat anymore, or you're eating more than usual. So changes in weight can accompany that, sleeping too much or too little, thoughts of suicide or ending your life, feeling guilty or worthless, and low energy and fatigue. And then in terms of anxiety disorders, some of these symptoms are about difficulty controlling your worries, which makes it hard to concentrate on other tasks, problems with sleep, and this is usually a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep, restlessness, muscle tension, feeling irritable, sweating, trembling, easily fatigued. So anxiety and depression are the kind of two prominent diagnoses that we see typically in like university counseling centers where we provide therapy services, and amongst teens as well. Any questions about any of these kind of symptoms or signs before I move on to talk about kind of ways to help folks in your life as well as help yourself?
So some children tend to kind of have anxiety as children, you know.
Like
I have always
temperament.
struggled about with how much to consider as a problem, like for example, they have sweaty hands and you can see that they're anxious. And for kids, it's even more kind of more problematic that you could say that, you know what, I'm more worried about today's categorizing kids very quickly in school and then drugging them for reasons that may not be necessarily enough, right? You know, we have had children. I mean, is it a broader range in terms of children than adults? So how do we distinguish? Has there been enough study done to let go of kids bit more easily being a little bit anxious than adults? So
Right, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of the research, what is out there on that, but something that I can tell you is so, so I think what's really important is if you decide to say, reach out for support for your kid that's showing signs of anxiety, and this isn't me saying just because they have symptoms of anxiety that they have a disorder by any means. And actually, we typically use different set of diagnostic criteria for children, but I'm not well versed in those because that's not my kind of population. But it really depends on the kind of mental health clinician that you seek out. So, for instance, counseling psychologists, many folks don't know this because, you know, why would you need to? But there's so many different kind of branches of psychology. So, counseling psychologists specifically focus on a more strengths-based empowerment approach. And we also focus through a multicultural lens and recognizing that there are certain symptoms that might show up in kids that we could attribute to cultural differences, right? Because the diagnostic criteria that I'm talking about, it's really based on kind of assumptions about what is normal in the West. So I think it's important to really think about who you're seeking out help from, what kind of framework they operate from. Some therapists will be quicker to diagnose and refer you to a psychiatrist, whereas some will be much kind of slower to even get to that process. So that fit with the therapist and you as the parent is crucial. Yeah.
well, thank you very much. I'm very happy that we have now therapists like you. But I feel like for a long time there has been a suffering around that. The small kids get very quickly nowadays diagnosed anxiety disorder, and get school teachers point out very quickly, very early, and little children are being drugged, and I am absolutely a parent who will stand against that. And then there's a tolerance issue also here. There's a lot of teachers that are not any more tolerant to the attention to kids. Yeah, that's why I just wanted to. We have to have specific counseling based on cultural differences.
I think there needs to be a lot more education around medication, right? Like, what are the side effects? What does it look like if the kid wants to get off the medication? So it's not a simple fix as some people might portray it as. So how to support someone with mental health issues? Oh, yeah, sorry. Previous slide. Yes. Feeling as if you're on pins and needles? Can I kind of explain that? It almost, I think the best way that I could describe it is us feeling like this kind of vibration through your body. A numbness, yeah, like a tingling. Like, have your hands ever gone numb from being so cold? So sometimes people with heightened anxiety will feel that very similar sensation. Does that help? Yeah.
شايف جنان ضغط فيه لكن مش شايف شغله يعني عشان تعرف.
So how to support someone? Do's and don'ts. So actively listen and show them empathy. Ask what you can do to help.
Yeah, I know.
Validate their emotions.
قديش حاجة
And
المطلعين؟
encourage them to seek professional help or help them access resources too, right? Because a lot of the times the first step into the mental health world is really difficult because you have to learn about what kind of therapists are out there and what's going to be the best fit for you. The don'ts, right? Saying things like it's all in your head, you're not the only one with problems, snap out of it, you have so much to be grateful for, just pray more. I mean, all of these things are incredibly invalidating to tell ourselves as well as tell each other, right? Especially with the second one, you're not the only one with problems. If we were always to compare our problems with someone else's, we're always going to find someone with a worse problem. So at the end of the day, if we keep doing that, nobody's going to be giving each other any empathy. We're not going to be caring for ourselves because we're never going to find a reason to. And that's just going to serve at our individual detriment as well as our community's detriment. So I have a little clip I wanted to show. It's pretty short, but let me kind of navigate this. Share. So this clip is about what it means to show empathy and how that looks different than sympathy. And some of you might have seen this. It's from the movie Inside Out. But yeah, let me just play it and.
Go to the moon.
Hey, it's gonna be okay. We can fix this. We just need to get back to headquarters. Which way to the train station?
I had a whole trip planned for us.
Hey, who's ticklish, huh? Here comes the tickle monster. Hey, Bing Bong, look at this. Oh, here's a fun game. You point to the train station and we all go there. Won't that be fun? Come on, to the train station.
I'm sorry they took your rabbit. They took something that you loved.
Sadness, don't make it feel worse.
Sorry. It's all I had left of Riley. I get you and Riley. Oh, they were wonderful. Once we flew back to Thai, we had breakfast twice that day.
Sadness.
I bet Riley liked it. Oh, she did. We were best friends. Okay now. Come on. The train station is this.
So I just think that is such a. No. Exit this. Let me reshare this. I just think that's such a wholesome clip. So, and I think this is something that a lot of us do is, so the first character's name is Joy, and then this little blue one is Sadness, and the elephant is Bing Bong. I think that's his name. So you could tell Joy was trying to make Bing Bong feel okay. She was trying to distract him from the sadness she was feeling, trying to kind of change the subject and move on. She didn't want him to feel it anymore, where sadness sat with him and validated him, right, and told him that is sad. And that's what he needed in that moment. So I think it comes from really good intention, right? That oftentimes when people come with us with problems, we want to take the pain away, we want to make it end or solve the problem. But sometimes that's not what somebody needs, and they just need someone that will sit there with them and listen to them and understand where they're coming from. So that's, I think, a good clip of kind of what it looks like to show empathy and what it looks like to really validate a person and what they're experiencing. All right, so we've talked a bit about how you might show somebody else care who's struggling with mental health. So let's talk about how you might care for yourself. So different coping skills. So I pulled out some things specific to when maybe you're feeling anxious or you're feeling depressed. So when you're feeling overwhelmed, anxious, nervous, you can try deep breathing. I know sometimes I think this gets thrown around like deep breathing is the solution, but our breath is actually really powerful because depending on how we control it, we can actually work ourselves up into a panic state, which means if we can do that, we can control our breath to induce a relaxation response. So taking deep breaths in and out for 3 seconds can be helpful. Focusing on your 5 senses. So if you're feeling anxious, you can look around in your environment and ask yourself, okay, what do I smell right now? What do I see right now? What do I hear right now? And that's really just a way to try and get you out of your head and more focused on your environment. Because we know anxiety is often accompanied with uncontrollable worry thoughts. And try to remind yourself that the feeling won't last forever. So what I mentioned earlier, sometimes you just have to ride the wave. Once it starts, it can be hard to stop it, but it will end. If you're feeling sad, down, or depressed, you can think about 3 positive things that you're grateful for that day. Do an activity that you enjoy. Distract yourself, take your mind off the problem for a while, and talk to yourself kindly. So the way, that little voice in our head, the self-talk that we do, that's also really powerful as well. It's the way that we talk to ourselves influences the way that we feel about ourselves and the way that we treat ourselves. So being really conscious about like, how do you talk to yourself? Is it in positive ways, or are you really hard on yourself? Do you invalidate yourself in your own emotions? All right. I think I'm getting close to the end here. So how to practice self-care, make it part of your routine, right? Don't just have it be something that you're like, oh, I'll do that eventually, but be really intentional about scheduling it into your day. Check in with each other as a family. So make this a normal part of your family atmosphere, your environment, of asking each other, how are you doing today? How are you feeling today? As parents, modeling that and making this okay and normal, right? Signaling to kids that this is a space where you can do that. But also take care of yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually. Our mental health is very much connected to kind of the other pieces of our health. So if you're not eating well, if you're not sleeping enough, your mental health is going to be impacted. If you're not living up to kind of your spiritual values and beliefs, your mental health is going to be impacted as well. So really thinking about this from kind of a holistic lens as well. I believe, oh yeah, and then I just have some resources here. Resources, these include, if you go to their websites, kind of tangible resources on how to kind of cope with various illnesses or struggles, as well as resources on how to get access to counseling services. So yeah, those are the 4 that I have up there right now. If anybody has questions or anything too about other resources, I'm happy to chat about that as well, but that's all I have for you. Yeah.
I have one question. Have you come across any study or research that people with strong faith will have this problem, or they're not making it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So faith and religion has been found to be a protective factor for a lot of mental health concerns as well as mental illnesses. So when I say that, every individual kind of has their own set of protective factors and risk factors that will either potentially amplify their chance of having mental health struggles or protect them from that. And we have found that faith and spirituality is one of them. So promoting that too within our youth could be a way of uplifting well-being as well as that protective factor.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you have that scenario where the elephant was kind of sad and fun. What about a scenario where the elephant was actually jumping and yelling around? What do you do then? The
Yeah.
sadness would have a hard time.
Jumping and
It's angry.
oh, in an angry way.
Aggressive.
Because aggressive, because not every human being having lost that would actually sit still in sadness.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, they would be really, particularly if you have a teenager,
Yeah.
would be
Yeah.
up in arms. So what do you do?
I remember that well. Yeah. So I think one thing, especially when it comes to anger, is one, there is that needed cooling down period sometimes, right? So maybe with your teenager, it's you feel like you can't communicate with them in the moment because they're so worked up. It's go take a walk, or we'll talk about this evening, just so they can get their system to kind of unwind a little bit, and then you can talk more clearly to them. And another piece of anger too is, it's not always, but sometimes we say it's a secondary emotion. So that's essentially our way of saying anger sometimes covers up emotions we don't actually want to show people. And that's typically like emotions that make us feel vulnerable. So if we're feeling sad or hurt by a person, something especially in the teenage sense, right? Of like, your kid might be really ticked at you and showing you that, right? But underneath that anger, I don't know, maybe they're sad that they felt like you didn't trust them in this way or whatever it may be. So I think something to keep in mind too as a parent is like, could there be something else under that anger that my kid is feeling but doesn't want to show me because those emotions feel scary and vulnerable to touch? Because anger is the easiest emotion to access, right? But it gets us in our defense mode. So if you can access other emotions, you can kind of start to connect in a better way as well. Actually start to communicate instead of yell at each other. Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you, but it's picking it complex, but I'm just trying to get at, often enough, it's not very easy.
Yeah.
Particularly multiple chores, and now I don't have time, to go to school and I have to go to work, so I don't have the downtime.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but maybe
often
you
we
could
just end up
revisit it
becoming-
later.
so, yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think you're right, we often try to become the happy,
Yeah.
and I think that sometimes just turns up
Yeah.
it's okay, it's not a big deal. That's usual.
Yeah.
So yeah, going back to faith again, so do you have any example, or have you seen people that the faith, instead of helping a person, taking them to the way, to the other extremes? Have you seen those examples, or?
Yeah, I've seen those examples through my own clinical experiences. I don't know what the research says, but I'm sure that it's there as well. But I often have seen it clinically when my clients hold an identity that's not accepted within their faith. So they feel rejected by their faith, or by their community.
Could you please explain?
Yeah, so working with clients who identify with the LGBTQ community. So, many faiths don't accept folks with those identities. So that's oftentimes when I see the most people struggle, because they almost feel this rejection anyways. And then there is, if you think about it in a different way too, there are kind of like internalized isms that we have when you think about, especially how like the Muslim community is portrayed, how immigrants are portrayed, or different ethnicities are portrayed. Some people internalize those messages and start to believe that they are bad and that they are those things. So I've seen that in therapy as well, whereas there's kind of like self-hate component because of what the world has told them that they need to hate about themselves. But I will say, typically people that make it to therapy and that I see at that point, they're already willing to work on that. And they're already willing to work on figuring out like, okay, how do I feel connected to that identity again? How do I feel protected by that again? But there are some people that don't make it to therapy either, you know, and they stay in that place.
So how do you, I mean, I'm pretty much sure that person is mentally sick. I mean, I'm talking about these people who just die in any, you know, in the name of a religion,
Mhm.
terrorism and all that.
Mm.
So this is definitely a mental state which is not, I think, acceptable to the society, or I think it's sickening to the level.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that piece, right? Like something's going on mentally to be in that state. Have I ever worked with anyone like that or read any literature? Not really, so I don't really feel like I can give you much there, honestly. But yeah, I mean, this is the tough thing too with mental health is, so many people don't ask for help until it's too late. So this is also another piece of why it's important for us to be kind of keeping an eye on our loved ones and our children and knowing kind of what some of these warning signs are. You don't have full control, right, whether they get help, but you might be able to point them in the direction that will get them closer to seeking help.
No, I think that I'm trying to extend on Basil's question is because, like you said, that people who have mental health issues are more, they have more chance of harming themselves. So which is a state that can be utilized in a very downtime manner in places.
Yeah.
Inshallah, alhamdulillah, we don't have that issue in this
Mhm.
country, but I going back, you have a problem like that, imagine why some people get into the state where they're ready
Yeah.
to harm themselves, basically.
Yep. Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a question of period.
Still trying to articulate this question here,
Mhm.
but what advice do you have on ways to ensure improvement? Because I think it's easy for us to accept that the way we support people and the way we regulate our own emotions are sufficient and are good,
Mhm.
but not, maybe perhaps metrics, but what can we do as an existing habit to make sure that we are doing our best to improve? Right, sure, I mean, I agree getting support and help is necessary, which we should, but in conjunction with that, like what life practices can we adopt to ensure we're doing that?
On an individual level?
Yes.
So I think it goes back to this piece I mentioned earlier, building their protective factors. So what are the things that you do that are going to make your life feel meaningful and filled with purpose? And what are the things that are going to allow you to get through those challenging times? Some people don't have those things, and that's when we start getting really concerned, especially when we're thinking about like suicidality. Is that's typically our approach as clinicians when somebody's in that state of how can we build your protective factors, how can we help you find meaning. So I think on an individual level, it's really important to identify what your values are, what is important to you and what aligns with your beliefs. And then take that next step and say, how am I acting on these values and beliefs? What am I doing to live these out? Because it's kind of that mindset of like self-actualization is what we would call it, is, you know, after your basic needs are met, right? You have shelter, food, safety in that way of how are you going to build yourself up in a way that is important to you and it's going to make you feel like you're here for a reason. Yeah, it's pretty vague. I don't have like things that tick off for you, right? Because it's at an individual level. But I think starting at that place of what are your values is important. Mhm. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. So I have a follow-up question on the prior, when she asked you about when someone is expressing their feeling as being angry or something.
Yeah.
I'm actually asking about the other extent, like, which I think is even worse situation, if they are not really expressing what they feel. So my question is there a way to know that might be an ongoing problem with the kids that they are not really expressing it, or is there a checklist that you know that they can say, okay, they are doing so and so and so, okay, they are good and they are happy in their
Right,
It's
yeah.
not great in their
They're functioning healthy or not, essentially. I'm sure there are kind of different assessments that child psychologists will do to kind of help you figure out the functioning pieces. But I mean, you can look at things like their behaviors, so how are they acting in the classroom? How are they treating their peers? Is there any kind of aggression or violence? There are some therapists that really focus on, you've probably seen kind of like drawings and interpreting kids' pictures that they create in their artwork as well. Because the idea is that the kids express to us what's going on for them in other ways that aren't verbal yet. So if we can look at those nonverbal pieces like their behaviors and checking with their teachers, how are they doing in this realm? See how they act at home. Are they acting two different ways, right, in the classroom and at home? Yeah, and then there's these other kind of approaches, like I mentioned, like the play therapy and the art therapy that could be pursued.
Thank you. So my second question is actually for me and my wife.
Yeah.
So we both are teachers. So we have the same observation that around exam time, all the students seem abnormal and they are really struggling and they are not happy and not interacting with us the way we used to in the non-exam time. So and I mean we can advise them to seek like help or something like that, but as you know, like maybe 5% to do and 95% to. So is there like a general advice that you can do from the exam time that make them like more self-aware and know what they need help or not?
Yeah.
Sure.
How old are the students?
So actually, my students are a little bit older, so we are DVMs, so we are, I would think like 20, 25.
Okay.
Her students are a bit younger, so like they are freshmen, so like just getting from high school.
Right, yeah. So you might have seen this in some colleges, but what a lot of universities do around exam time is they do things kind of like the self-care week where they set up they set up activities to help the folks reduce their anxiety. And that's because it's inevitable that their stress is going to rise along exam time. They're probably not getting as much sleep as they used to. They're probably not eating as well as they used to. So a lot of things are just like not flowing in the way that they need to be, right? So I think in just something that you could do is, I don't know how we talk about this with your students, right? But acknowledging that piece of like recognizing like clearly you all aren't doing as well and it's understandable with these exams coming up. However, reminding them that they need to kind of take care of themselves in X, Y, and Z ways. And maybe depending on, like with my students, if they have heavy weeks coming up, I will give them a week off of class to focus on that. So just checking in with what are your needs, what can I help you with as your teacher, right? So you can't control all of that. But maybe just like simply being able to acknowledge them and ask them like, what would you need that would be helpful within reason, right? Yeah.
You know, to do like coordinating these activities.
I don't know.
Yeah,
They
we
do.
have a
Yeah.
lot of mental health, particularly for
I'm
class
not talking about
two,
this course, I'm talking about like what you
Like
said.
those kind of self-care weeks.
Yeah,
like,
I think so. I mean, they work through dorms also.
Oh, they work through the dorms and stuff? Yeah.
So I have a last question from someone in the Zoom team. So she says, I have a question. How do you manage mental stress when you know it's going to be a long-term feeling for you?
Yeah.
Because maybe you are in a interview which kind of feels toxic and makes you lose sleep a lot.
Yeah.
And she goes on, but in the same.
Right. Well, it sounds like there's a lot going on there. So there's so many ways to go about this. I would never actively encourage someone to stay in an incredibly toxic or harmful situation. I also recognize you're not always in control of that. So I think this goes back to the point of one is finding meaning in what you're doing. What is the research group going to give you? How is it going to help you get to where you need to go? Right? Kind of a way of like, okay, if I just get through this much, it will get me to this thing that's even more important than to me, and I can keep pushing. And then the second piece would be to find supports wherever you can, right? Whether it's within that research team or your advisor or other professors in the department, but a place where you can talk about your frustrations and know that they're not going to be used against you in any way. So sensing out like where are your safe spots, which can be tricky in the world of academia, but being able to kind of build those relationships. Yeah.
I have a question. So, besides general, besides reasons and root causes that can cause mental health, mental illness in general, is there any specific root causes or reasons that affects mental illness in Muslim communities in the West? That's not a root cause that affects other communities or affects mental illness in general.
I don't know about things very unique to Muslim communities, but I know things that are unique, obviously, to ethnic and religious minority communities in the U.S. So, the things, especially with children growing up here in the States, right, like away from parents' homeland, in a country that has a lot of discrimination and prejudicial attitudes, those things influence our mental health. They influence the way that we develop our identities. So we have kind of different forms of identities that we develop, and kind of toggling between two cultures can influence that. Obviously, the kind of experiences you get from other people in terms of maltreatment because of your identities. But it goes back to that piece of I mentioned earlier of like those things are risk factors that our Muslim youth have that say like Christian youth don't have in the same way, right? But it goes along that piece of like, okay, we recognize these are very real challenges, and we also know that like we can use their identities to actually help them like feel stronger and more protected. So starting that piece early on of developing their identities in a positive direction can be helpful in like mitigating those harmful effects. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the questions.
Thank you.